This is Jim Sedore. I am your personal preacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. And we are back, and this time we're going to be studying the book of Romans. And as you know, we're also studying the book of Hebrews and the book of Genesis, as well as a jet tour through the Bible. But today we're going to continue in what I refer to as my favorite chapter in my favorite book, and that is Romans 8. Believe it or not, last time I did a teaching in Romans, I was in Romans 8:31, if God be for us, who can be against us? And I got as far as 2 verses. So I'm still in verse 32. And I can't emphasize enough that everything that God has done, He's doing on our behalf. It's based on the finished work of the cross, where God didn't even spare His own Son. Why? So He could redeem mankind back to Himself. Now, the first thing you may wonder, if we're not taught in these things, is, well, why does God have to do this? Well, because He's sovereign, and He can do it. He wanted to do it. But God never goes against His own principles. God's holy, God's righteous, He's omnipotent, He's full of all knowledge. And so He knows what has to be done to reconcile fallen man to Himself. And so in that knowledge and understanding, He's the one who determined that it had to be the sacrificial death of Himself on our behalf. You know, I'll never forget the first time I taught that Christ was the Creator God. And the people there just sat aghast. It's like I told you guys. I went to a service on Sunday, and the preacher preached that God the Father created the universe. God the Father did not create the universe. God the Son created the universe. And they had never heard this before, these people I was talking to. And they were just dumbfounded as I talked about it. And they said, Jimmy, are you sure you know what you're talking about? And boy, I'm sure preachers since the time of Jesus have been asked that same question. My answer was, boy, I sure hope so. But it wasn't long that I read where someone else had made the statement that Christ was the Creator. I think it was John MacArthur. And of course, since that, I've seen it many, many times. It's being taught more and more as the church grows. I think it was Martin Luther, actually, who really struggled over this. If you go to Psalm 110, this is what it says. The Lord said unto my Lord. Now, I've taught you this before, and the first mention of Lord in Psalm 110 is fully capitalized. So the fully capitalized Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And Luther just couldn't comprehend and wrestled with this for years. And then one morning, as it's taught, he came bursting out of his study. He screamed to his wife, I get it, I see it, I understand. And she's like, well, what do you see, Martin? It was God crying out to God. The Lord said unto my Lord. And that's what it is, because Jesus Christ is God. So if you go back to Romans 8, go ahead and flip to Romans 8, get down to verse 26. And in just a few verses, all 3 persons of the Godhead are here. I know people like to confuse or refuse to believe that there's a Trinity. They say God is one. And God is one. But He's in 3 persons, as we see in Romans 8:26. Listen to this. Likewise the Spirit, now that's capital S, also helpeth our infirmities. And he that searcheth the hearts knoweth what is in the mind of the Spirit, because he maketh intercession for the saints according to the will of God. Now, there you got the Spirit and God in his triune entity. But you come down a little further in the chapter, and you're dealing with Christ. So here you've got all three persons of the Trinity within just a few verses. And yet when you see the term God, it's the triune God, the whole Godhead, as Paul calls it. It's God the Father, it's God the Son, it's God the Holy Spirit. Now, I know these things are difficult to understand. I don't completely understand them, but I completely believe them. Three distinct entities, and yet one God. So come down to verse 33, and since Christ died and God let him die, God permitted it to happen, he directed that it had to happen in order to purchase salvation for us. There would never have been one person saved, not even an Old Testament economy, without the work of the cross. It had to be that way to satisfy a holy and righteous God. Now, let's read Romans 8:33. Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justified. Now, that word elect, what's that mean? Does that mean you were chosen? Let me ask you this. When you elect someone, whether it be for a political position or an educational position, you designate them to be whatever you intend them to be. And the word election in the Greek is exactly that. It's an act of choosing, and that's what God has done with every one of his believers. Now, as I finish this chapter, I want to take you back to some of the statements that Jesus made during his earthly ministry. That he has chosen us. That no man can come to God on his own prerogative. Something we like to think, well, I can just decide to go with God anytime I feel like it. No, you can't. You can't. You have to be back again in that chosen aspect. But on the other hand, you've got this in the scriptures. Whosoever will. So that's confusing, right? So read that verse again. Romans 8:33. Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Not our neighbor, not our boss, not your wife, not your sister, your brother. We don't have to give an account to any of them. It's God. The triune God, the creator God, the sustainer God. He's the one who determines who we are and what we are in the realm of the Spirit. Now, verse 34. So, if he's the one who's chosen us, if he's the one who's forgiven us, if he's the one who's taken care of us unto himself, then, Romans 8:34, who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, rather, that is risen again. Now, remember Paul writing to believers. You see how he's constantly hammering home that everything revolves around that finished work of the cross. The most important occurrence in the entire history of man. The fact that God died, the fact that Christ died, his divine blood was shed. Hebrews 9:22, remember this? Without the shedding of blood there is no remission. So you can't bypass the blood. It had to happen. He's the one who died and rose from the dead. Jesus is the one who is at the right hand of God interceding for us. Jesus is the one watching out for us, watching over us. He's the one who promised, if God is for you, who can be against you? And boy, always keep that in mind. But you cannot ever interpret that to mean that nothing bad could happen to the believer, like Joel Osteen says. Don't ever get the idea that the things of this world can't attack the believer. Remember, Satan can transform himself into an angel of light, and does that often. You see, many of the churches today are satanic in their teachings. Now, they don't do it on purpose, but Satan is very, very subtle. All you need is 1 or less than 1% error, and the rest of it's error. Do you understand what I'm saying? So God is sovereign. Now, I'm going to bring you into a series of verses that are disturbing, especially to denominations. And that's that group of people who feel that they cannot be assured of salvation, like the Catholics, like the Mormons. They think that you have to hope you make it, you have to work to make it, you have to work forever, all your life. You have to be sure that you don't ever sin in such a way that you will lose your salvation and end up in hell instead of heaven. But these verses I'm going to teach you right now fly in the face of that thinking. Because all I'm going to show you is what the book says. Remember, that's how I teach. I just tell you what the book says. If you read along with me, you can see it yourself. Romans 8:35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? And if you take that in its context, that's a great question. Is there anybody? Is there anybody who's going to separate us from the love of Christ? The word that comes next is tribulation. The question is asked by Paul. Shall tribulation separate you from the love of Christ? You know, the word tribulation is used something like 30 times in the New Testament. And with one exception, the word is associated with the activities surrounding the believer. You go back into the book of Revelation, in fact. Let's turn there real quick so I can show you this. And the letters to the 7 churches in the opening chapters. Revelation 2, verse 9. This is the letter to the church in Smyrna. Smyrna actually means to smell like myrrh. And myrrh, for those of you that don't know, does not exude its fragrance until it is crushed. This is exactly what the church at Smyrna was indicating. That the more persecution crushed those believers, they were exuded by their testimony. You see, that's why Satan had to give up persecuting the early church, because he couldn't get in front of it. The more he persecuted the church, the more it thrived. So he took the opposite attack and the brilliant attack, and that was to join them. And that's when Christianity began to slide. Revelation 2:9. I know thy works, and tribulation and poverty. So God knew about their tribulation at the church at Smyrna, that they were going through this horrible pressure. But thou art rich. They were poor materialistically, because the persecution was taking them away from their income. It probably took them away from their job. It took all their wealth away, if they had any. That was part of the persecution. But spiritually, they were what? They were rich. The church today is just the opposite. And that's what the letter to the church at Laodicea was all about. Let's read that. Revelation 2:9-10. I know thy works, and tribulation and poverty, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, believers, Jewish believers, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. They were impostors. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. So did believers suffer? Unlike what Joel Osteen preaches, you bet they did. It goes on, behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Now, I think the 10 days refers to the 10 distinct periods of time during the Roman Empire when the church came under horrible persecution. Yet these believers did not give up. It goes on, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Now, what does that mean? Well, go back to Romans again. Romans 8:35. So we're going to suffer tribulation, right? And as I taught you before, it's only been in the last couple of 100 years that Western civilization has been able to guarantee the rights of an individual for freedom and all that stuff to worship. But for the most part, there's been, that was unheard of. Before that, before the Pilgrims came over, there was horrible persecution. We are living in an extremely different time than most Christians in history, because we've got our government that, so far at least, guarantees our right to assembly and to religion. Listen to verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness? Nakedness? What's that mean? Well, Paul is describing that there were times that he went through nakedness. He was cold, he was thirsty, he was hungry. How did Paul die? He was beheaded by the sword in Rome, or peril, or sword, and there's nothing said that we will be spared the sword. None of this is going to separate us from the Lord. Let me ask you this. Can the devil bring in enough persecution to force a believer out of his place in the body of Christ? Can't be done. God has guaranteed that because of the work of the cross, we are secure. God is our Father. He is responsible for us. Did you know that? When you become a believer, according to Romans 8, you become a child of God. You're adopted into the family. And the legal aspect of adoption means that the person who adopts is absolutely responsible for your well-being. Not because of what you've done, not because of what you merit, but only because of what Jesus has done. We never maintain our assurance of salvation and security because of who we are, or what we are, or what we've done. That's never part of the picture. Everything that keeps us secure is the finished work of the cross of Christ. Now, Romans 36, as it is written, for thy sake, that is the sake of Christ at the cross, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. You know, I read something a couple of years ago that when Chicago was still the capital of the meatpacking business, they would slaughter the cattle, they would slaughter the sheep and the hogs, all within this giant complex. If you ever can get the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, I have it in my library. It'll tell you all about that meatpacking business. But anyway, a visitor was being taken on a tour of one of these meatpacking plants, and he couldn't help but notice, as he went from the hog killing area with all the squealing and the commotion that goes on, to the sheep killing area, what happened? Utter silence. The sheep never said a word. And I've witnessed that myself when I lived up north in the farming area. I'll never forget that when they take sheep to the slaughter, they have a goat, and that goat leads those sheep up to the place where they're to be killed. The goat goes out the side door. He goes to get another bunch of sheep, and they simply slaughter the sheep. It's amazing. They never do anything. They never say anything. They go to their death in utter silence. And this is the exact analogy that Paul draws of the believer. We may someday come to the place where we too will go to like sheep to the slaughter. And if we scream and squeal like a pig, that's not going to happen because that's not the way God works. Remember what Isaiah said about the Lamb of God? Go back to Isaiah 53. Boy, I love this chapter. I don't know who it was, but somebody referred to Isaiah 53 as the fifth gospel. It says this: He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb. So he opened not his mouth. Why? Because there was no need for him to scream and argue. So it's been the same thing for Christians down through the ages. You take a lot of, macho guys today. Most of them think Christianity is for women and children. But boy, they got it all wrong. Because back in the days when persecution was running rampant, it took 10 times more for a man to stand up, to be slaughtered, to be burned at the stake, to be put on the rack. The rack back then was when their bones were all broken without killing them. That takes a real man. And I bet you most of those so-called macho guys, that you see coming up from Guatemala and all the MS-13 people, they couldn't hold a candle to these early Christians. Paul says it's all part and parcel of what God has imparted to us. His promise that even though we may have to go through these things, it's never going to separate us from the love of Christ. Man, you could live to 100. What's that compared to eternity? Eternity. Never ending, forever and ever and ever. But the human race will not even consider it. All they look at is, what can I have here and now? What can I enjoy today? This guy, Osteen, your best life now. Your best life now. Who gives a darn about your best life now? I want my best life in eternity. But this Bible looks at everything in the light of eternity. That's why you have to take this blessed assurance that regardless of what happens, nothing can separate us from spending eternity with Jesus. Now, Romans 8:37. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. I love that passage, man. Were those sheep being led to their death as conquerors? No, that's an analogy. We're led like sheep to the slaughter, but the verse says, yet we are conquerors. That's fantastic, right? So, you don't have to mind being meek, you don't have to mind being quiet, you don't have to mind coming under persecution and doing something like squealing, like a hog, because in the end, you're going to end up more than conquerors. How? Through the one that loved us, Jesus Christ. You and I, in the energy of the flesh, can do nothing. We are nothing. Now verse 38 goes like this. For I am persuaded. What does that mean, persuaded? Well, convinced. The argument that you've heard convinces you. I think it was King Agrippa back in Acts 26 where Paul was witnessing to him. And what did King Agrippa say to Paul? Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. That's what Agrippa said to Paul. I don't think that King Agrippa ever believed the gospel and became a Christian, because Agrippa could never be convinced that what Paul was telling him was true. And that's where a lot of people today are. They hear the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4, they hear the book taught, and they're not convinced. They can't believe it. And when I first read Romans 10:9, I gave the Bible back to my wife and I said, I don't believe that. That's too simple. And a lot of people feel the same way. I've had people approach me and say, well, what have you got? And I tell them, what I come back with is, I can't believe it. I can't believe that's all it takes. But by faith, I do. Jim, you mean to tell me that I can have all this free for nothing? That's exactly what I thought. I can't believe that. If I simply say with my mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord, and I believe in my heart God raised him from the dead, I'll be saved? I just couldn't believe that. Well, I beg your pardon, but until you believe it, you can't have it. I actually needed confirmation from a true Christian that what I was reading was true. Now, Romans 8:38, and this is where we're going to end it for today. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come. Now let me ask you, why do you suppose the Holy Spirit inspired the Apostle Paul to start with death instead of life? Stop and think for a second. What's he driving at? Well, death is the easy way out. That's why you have so many suicides. They think it's an easy way out. They can't cope with their problems. They can't cope with their circumstances. They take their life. And that ends it as far as that life is concerned. But what about life? We're living in a world that's filled with heartache and turmoil. Even Jesus said you're going to face, persecution. A life that's lived with all these kinds of oppositions in the home and the family. Hey man, life is difficult. Life is not easy. I read a book sometime that somebody sent me, and I almost had to quit reading it because all the writer was pointing out were all these things that make life difficult. I only got about halfway through that book, and then I actually tossed it. It wasn't what I wanted to be thinking about. Death is easy by comparison, but Paul tells us that even all the difficulties of life cannot separate us from the love of God. Look at what he went through. So, the word principalities here in the Greek is arche, A-R-C-H-E. It deals with people that are in a high position. It says, for I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come. So this word, principalities, deals with people in high position. The word power is from the Greek word dunamis, from which we get dynamo, and it means energy. Paul here is delineating that principalities, the position and the energy come from that position and are going to do everything they can to take us away from the love of Christ, but they can't do it. Next time, I'll take you to Ephesians chapter 6 and enlighten you even more. There, the word powers is used a little differently than in Romans. It's not speaking of energy, but again, power as Jesus gave to the 12 when they went out to perform the miracles. Jesus gave that power to the 12. He didn't give the power to Benny Hinn. Anyway, the powers that be in the realm of Satan are positioned, and they are loaded with energy and seemingly never run out. I'll get into that a little bit more as we continue in our study of Romans next time. Anyway, that's going to do it for today's teaching. This is Jim Sedore. I am your personal preacher. You're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hope you'll have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore, and I am your personal preacher. I wanted to thank you for listening to the Bible Exposition channel. If you like what you hear, share it with your friends and family.